July, stand by. August, look out, you must. September, remember. October, all over. Now, that was an adage that my primary school principal taught us on the lookout for the hurricane season. And we're in the month of June, where as Jamaicans or people in the Caribbean, we're looking forward to two things that's coming around the corner. Summer, that we anticipate with, I guess, an excited and a happy heart. The hurricane season, perhaps not so much. In the context of this podcast episode, we'll be looking at environmental risk management. And we are doing this discussion or having this discussion against the backdrop of World Environment Week. And we have today in the Global Yardie guest seat an environmental risk management expert with over 30 years experience in the field. She is the CEO and chairman of Environmental Solutions Ltd, Miss Eleanor Jones. Miss Eleanor Jones, welcome to the Global Yardie podcast.
Thank you so much, Madam Global Yardie.
How are you doing, Miss Jones?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
The last time I saw you, we were both in Dubai, oohing and eyeing over the light display in the dome. Do you recall?
Yes, that was an outstanding and really mind-blowing conference from several perspectives. So here we are again now talking about what we need, what we need.
Absolutely. And now that we're going to be discussing environmental risk management, and of course, you know, who better to do it than you, maybe if there are insights from COP28 that could filter in, we will look forward to that. But again, we mentioned that we're having this conversation against the backdrop of World Environment Week. So just Wednesday, we celebrated World Environment Day. That was the theme: land restoration, desertification, and combating drought resilience. Today is World Food Safety Day. Tomorrow looks at World Oceans Day. And all of that correlates with environmental risk management. Could you put that into context for us?
Okay, certainly. Thank you very much. We're talking about our land, our future, which was a part of the theme of World Environment Week this year.
Yes.
And if we are concerned about our planet and preserving our life support systems, we have to understand that as human beings, we're living within these natural systems. We have built into the natural systems, which means that we have disturbed them, we have disrupted them. And in disrupting, in science, we know you disrupt one aspect of a system, you're going to get feedback, and that feedback can be positive or negative. And what we have been doing is engendering negative feedback for the most part. And if we think of the climate change, which is concerning us a great deal now from several perspectives, the effect of global warming and what it is doing, we have to think of this risk, this vulnerability which we have. We are exposed to natural systems. We can't do anything about them, but we can do something about how we manage this environmental risk which accrues from our actions. So environmental risk is about looking at vulnerability that we have to natural extreme events, looking at how we might reduce our vulnerability, take charge of it, so that we have less damage and loss. So that's what risk management is essentially about. Understanding the science, understanding the reasons, and how we can minimize, maybe not eliminate totally, but how we can reduce.
Well, thank you so much for that context. And I made sure to bring my notes to the table today because I've heard you in previous conversations and dialogue before, speaking on the issue of risk management and also in the context of disaster preparedness where the Caribbean is concerned. And you've mentioned previously the importance on focusing on not just I think you were saying not just maybe recovery, or there's a difference between recovery, relief, and preparedness or something. Can you take us through those areas?
In the Caribbean, we have tended to pay a lot of attention to preparedness and relief. And we have also paid a lot of attention to hurricanes and storms. But the fact is that the Caribbean is a multi-hazard environment. There are many. Some of our islands have volcanic eruptions. Some of them have volcanic eruptions occurring almost coming behind hurricanes and storms, flood events, and we have earthquakes. We have neighbors that have had major damage and loss. Jamaica has been fortunate so far in that we have slipped a major earthquake, but it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so we really need to pay attention to what it is that we're doing. And this preparedness and response, the focus, because of the major damage that has occurred, especially within the last decade. If we look back at the hurricanes Irma, Maria, Dorian, where they sat over and really devastated our neighboring countries. We have got in Jamaica some of the effects, but what has happened is that the Caribbean, CARICOM has determined that we need to really strengthen what they call a pathway to resilience, because we cannot afford to continue to have devastation of our GDP, land, livelihood. We have to pay attention to people. And so the focus now is on recovery. Okay. Preparedness and response is important because you have to alleviate suffering.
So the preparedness is before?
Preparedness is before. Preparedness is what you put in place to manage the event when it occurs, right? The response is how you manage the event, you know, the relief. Recovery now, and what we have done is look at recovery in terms of reconstruction and rehabilitation. But recovery is so much more than that, because what you're talking about is building back better. That's the phrase that is used. Build back better so that what you have lost, you don't repeat or reconstruct the vulnerability, but you improve on that and bounce forward so that you are more resilient, you lose less in the future. And what is important, again, coming out of the Caribbean, because within the Caribbean context, they have developed a national framework for recovery. And several countries, including Jamaica, have taken on this framework and trying to adapt it to the local circumstance. And one of the important aspects of that framework is what we are emphasizing, pre-disaster recovery planning. Because what it is saying is that long before a disaster occurs, you need to begin to build your database, look at what you have, what are your assets. If you are in agriculture, if you are a farmer, you need to know, what do I have in the ground?
Right.
So when the loss comes, you know what you will have lost. If you don't know what you have, then you won't know what you will have lost. And then another important part of it is continuity planning. Business continuity planning, government continuity planning. So you look at the main aspects of your operations and what do we need to do to minimize, to ensure that if we have a dislocating event like a hurricane or like an earthquake or like floods, or the pandemic was a huge one that no one could have predicted, and it came on top of everything else.
Everything else.
Yeah.
Right. I love how in your response you provided a very good outline and you touched on several things that we're going to pull back so you can take us through at certain levels, because certainly when we think about disaster preparedness, we always think about it from the context of this national framework. And I say this because even as a child or a teenager, now a working person growing up, the minute you hear about preparedness, we think about the tin food, right? Stocking the tin food, the baby formula, chopping down the trees that are close to the house and battening down windows. And we do know that preparedness is much more than that. So while at the national level, there are institutions that have certain responsibilities. I think the purpose of this interview, we would want people to come away with some other concrete understanding of what are even some of the local responsibilities. And you mentioned the adaptation of the framework locally. So what does that look like, and you know, how far or what's the status in terms of or how robust is Jamaica's readiness or preparedness plan? Or, you know, what does that look like? So
okay, you know, we have ODPEM, which is the central, and then you have a national national framework, which is actually led by the Prime Minister, as it is in many other territories within the Caribbean.
Because he's the Chief of Defense?
Yeah, and because he's the Chief of Country and Operations, and cuts across all ministries, because it's an all-of government, and I think that's something that we need to really pay attention to.
Love that.
Most people think that it's an ODPEM issue, or, you know, so they should deal with it, but it's everybody's responsibility. And if you have a drain, for example, that is close to you, and you're waiting for the government to come to clean it. When that drain overflows or floods out and it affects your children, it affects you, you are responsible. So you really ought to take responsibility for some of these things. I remember many years ago we had some major flood rains out in the country, Clarendon and so on. And going to some of the areas and talking to people, which is very important, they share their experiences. This lady said that they used to clean the sinkholes. The citizens used to clean the sinkholes.
Yes.
But things had come to the point where they didn't want to do it anymore, and they were waiting for the government to do it. So, of course, the sinkholes got blocked, and places flooded out. People lost land. So you have a certain amount of responsibility, and I think it's not a government issue. Government sets a framework, but it is an individual issue. It's a community issue. It's a private sector issue. It's an everybody issue. And I think if we begin to look at it that way, and another thing that we talk about with preparing is self-insurance. Now, self-insurance means if you have a house, you want to look at your roof. You want to make sure that, try and see that your roof is really sturdy. Try and see that your windows are sturdy. Look at what is around you. You mentioned about the trees. That's an important part of pre-disaster planning, you know. And so it's a new day. It's a new day because we see more and more events happening, and we see the hydrometeorological events, which are so startling. The hurricanes, the storms. What you want to remember also in the case of Jamaica, we have lost a lot more in terms of value from storm events or flood events, sometimes more than a hurricane, because hurricane comes with wind.
Yes.
And some hurricanes have a lot of rain, some don't. Every hurricane is different. So you have to pay attention to what is coming and how, and listen to the forecast. But long before that, you want to look at how do I operate? What do I have if I were to lose something? Can I get back up and running as quickly as possible?
And following from that, you know, how you ended that, you know, how can I get up and running as quickly as possible? I heard you mention, you know, it's a new day, and I think to the local context, maybe it's also applicable across the Caribbean, the rise of entrepreneurship, a lot of businesses, and even if not in the entrepreneurial context, outside of just the focus on ODPEM and the central government or national framework for disaster, businesses, schools, you know, other organizations need to be considering the same things that you're talking about, the level of preparedness.
Right.
How do we bounce back? Because we've seen, as you mentioned, with the pandemic, that caused, you know, widespread disruption. And so with disaster planning, it's much more than letting us go home half day to bum rush the supermarkets.
That's right.
So what advice do you have, you know, at the other levels across the businesses, across schools, or you know, all of those in terms of the recovery and the kind of planning that they should be considering?
Yeah, well, you need to look at where you are located.
Okay.
That's another thing. And that's a very important consideration for us. We talk about it all the time. Living on the riverbanks, you're living on the slopes, and you're leaving yourself exposed. Now, one of the sad realities is that options are critical, and that is where government comes in, because you have to have the policy framework. It's all well and good to say to people, don't go there, but then where do they go? You know, so
Right.
the options for persons in terms of where you live is very important, because each time one of these events comes and wipes you out, it does exactly that. It wipes you out, and it's very difficult to pick up and to restore, bring yourself back. So you want to make sure that you're not living in the wrong place, you know, as far as possible. Don't go to the gully bank because it is easy.
Rent-free.
Yeah, and rent-free, exactly, because sometimes there are options, but people don't choose that. They choose the thing that is most convenient. But the most convenient thing is sometimes the most damaging and the most hurtful. So you have to pay attention to that, and not just turn your ears off because, okay, I have to deal with today, I can't deal with tomorrow. And that's also a reality. I don't have the means, and we like to say we don't have the means, but sometimes we just need to use our thoughts, and it's not everything is money. It's also an attitude and an approach.
Right. So at the business level now, I'm a business owner, or I guess I don't know if how else I would want to conceptualize it, or whatever other service provider that exists.
Right.
What are some of the things that they would look at now from a more commercial aspect?
Well, they want to look at your energy supply, power supply, because we are all dependent on the central power providers, and they're trying their best to make sure that they can get back up and running. So you want to look at your energy supply. You want to look at your water supply. You want to look at your sanitation. And then your goods. How do I protect my goods? Do I store things on the floor? And this is preparedness. Or do I elevate in case? Do I, depending on where I am, you may have flood waters coming in. You want to be sure that you protect yourself against that. And then you look at the kinds of products that you carry, depending on the nature. And if you are an entrepreneur, you may be thinking about what do I need to help my neighbor, because basic goods are important. And so from a business standpoint, how do I get to work is another thing. Transportation sector, is there an option for me if something happens? What are the alternatives? What can I do? You have to begin to think outside of the box, so to speak.
I love that you went there, because even for me, and I'm sure you would have observed, with the pandemic, there was a very huge emphasis on the new normal, digital transformation, but it does seem that a lot of companies have gone right back to pre-pandemic operations. And so, that's part of the preparation aspect as well, to see if there are teams that can work from home, what of the equipment, and as I love that you mentioned the transportation. So it's actually started to stimulate the thought about what does the community preparedness look like, and especially now in the context of climate justice, which is now the people-centered approach to climate action and resilience building. What is the new way that we can look at community preparedness outside of identifying the ideal place for a shelter and how to fix up the shelter? What are some of the other things that we can now do?
It's like mutual aid, what we call mutual aid. What do I have that maybe I can make available to my neighbors? I know in the case of the tourism sector, I remember several years ago working with the Caribbean Hotel Association. And as we did the preparedness for the hotel, we talked about mutual aid so that hoteliers looked at who had equipment, who had hardware stores, who had food, who had places that maybe some of my guests would need to shelter in if I needed to call on my neighbor for something. In Jamaica, we tend to say, well, okay, you run across to your neighbor if something goes wrong with your roof. But that we need to maybe formalize that a little bit more. I think we have moved a bit away from community, especially in the urban environment, because we have become so urbanized now. We need to maybe look back at our neighbors. We have community organizations, neighborhood citizens associations. Work through those. If you have those, let's now focus on something other than crime, or other than who is building next door, because that's very important. But how are we going to handle a crisis? Because all of us are exposed. Can we help each other? I think it may still sound esoteric, but I think that's something that we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, no, that's a full circle moment for me, because I reflect on previous podcast episodes that I would have had last year looking at climate justice, and we had several guests from the differently abled or disabled community, and sometimes they mentioned that in the event that some persons, they may live with other able-bodied people in the home to look after them, but you have people who are shut in and who live on their own. So are community organizations doing that kind of resident mapping or stakeholder mapping to say, can we assign Miss Eleanor Jones to take care of Mr. John Doe in the event of XYZ, and to provide that? So that is something that they could put into an outline of a plan.
Yes,
to get
absolutely.
Ready. I like that. So,
absolutely.
Thank you. So going back to another aspect of what you said earlier, the continuity planning. How is continuity planning different from the recovery or relief or preparedness
Okay,
aspect?
well, continuity planning is a part of the recovery.
Okay.
Not so much relief.
How is recovery different from relief? Sorry, if I might.
Okay, relief is if I've lost my roof and I've lost my beds and so on. I bring in beds. You get bed, you get sleeping, you get blankets. You get some food, clothing, whatever, and even the shelter, you're able to go to a shelter so that it's a humanitarian aspect of things. So you're dealing with the person's ability to just survive the moment, okay? So relief is more related to the moment, you know, the event. How do I get a little bit more comfort or less discomfort, not comfort, but less discomfort. Whereas recovery now is really about how am I going to get myself back up and back to, not back to normal, but even better than I was before.
Okay.
You know, and it's not just about building back the road or building back the bridge, because we have tended to focus on the construction aspect. Now we're saying we also need to focus on the people aspect, you know, the livelihoods and so on.
Okay, so it's and I guess that's how it becomes like a subset of resilience.
Yes,
because it's
absolutely.
what you do so that this doesn't happen to me again.
Yes,
so
that's
I'm just
right.
trying to visualize what you're saying. When you mention a very good example of in some communities where they may have done drain cleanings.
Yes.
So in the same way, you have some organizations that they take coastal cleanup a step further than not just waiting on international coastal
Right.
cleanup. Even my Rotary Club, for example, we used to organize quarterly. So
Yeah.
maybe some community organizations could coordinate
Yes.
certain drain cleanup and
Yeah,
community cleanup
right.
activities as a consistent part of, you know, is it recovery?
Yeah.
So that in the event of a flood or some other extreme event,
Yeah,
you're
your
not
pre-disaster planning.
pre-disaster
That's
planning.
the key. That's what recovery is, pre-disaster.
Right.
You have post-disaster, because after the disaster you have to look at the needs, because you will have had losses.
Right.
So the recovery is informed by that. But if you do the pre-disaster planning, your disaster risk financing, for instance, procurement procedures, you know, you even the small, medium, large businesses, what are the procedures that I need to go through to gain, to purchase, and to pay, and that kind of thing is important before, because then it helps you with the decision making. Because when you have a major event, you're kind of overwhelmed. Whereas if you're planning before, you have some systems in place that you can fall back on.
Right. I like that you mentioned risk financing. And so I'm aware that Jamaica at some time we would have either sponsored or subscribed to a catastrophe bond. And so in the event that there's a disaster and it's at a certain level, is it that we get a payout?
Yes, it's triggered by, it's a Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Fund, which was introduced several years ago, and you know, so we are members of that, and it's parametric. Initially it was wind damage, but they've expanded it now to include flood and so on. But beyond that, the Ministry of Finance has done a very good job in terms of negotiating for some of these funds that we can draw down upon when in the event that we have a major damage and loss. So it's all about that that is pre-disaster planning. So you're putting in place the sources that you can access should there be an event.
I'm thinking if that's something that's sufficient for the, obviously I guess it depends on the extent
Right.
to which we would be impacted in the case of a disaster and how the disbursement would work.
Yeah.
But I guess a part of being resilient can also look at how different entities, whether not NGOs or commercial organizations, how can you develop some system of self-reliance or even your own version of a catastrophe bond or risk financing? What does that look like at that level? Because I know some small businesses, it might be challenging, they're cash strapped, but for persons who have never given thought and may have room to put something like that in place, what could that look like for them?
Yeah, well, you have just said it. You have never given thought. So the first thing to do is to give
Think
thought
about it.
and to think. You know, what we used to call a rainy day fund?
So no mattress thing. No,
Yeah,
but
right. A rainy day fund. So you begin to think, well, if this happens, you know, I can fall back on that. And maybe sometimes you have to go. You know, the credit unions. We need to bring in all of these people. This is why I'm saying it's an all of society approach. You know, your credit unions play a role, an important role, especially with small businesses and so on. And the banks, a little more difficult because you have more hurdles to cross. But your financial institutions, and you don't want people being exposed, if you will, which happens at some of these micro things with exorbitant interest rates, because it sets you back too, you know. So you have to begin to think of that.
Right. I have another question for you linked to continuity planning, and I want you to take maybe like a sectoral approach to it. But before I get there, I hope I remember after this. COP28, it's a little far in the rear view now, because we're 6 months into the new year. But I don't know if there are any sort of insights or any dialogue that may have, left an impression on you in terms of informing the way forward for us. And especially closer in the rear view is the Small Island Developing States Conference that would have happened in Antigua, or any other event, so to speak. Is there anything that has come from those?
Yeah, well, in the case of COP, as always, it's we come together, we learn from each other. What do we do? What do we take back home? You see examples of people doing things, but two major agreements, so to speak. The whole business of loss and damage financing was on the negotiating table for some time, which really relates to how, again, the developed world or countries that are more wealthy will assist countries that are suffering as a consequence of the climate disruption. And so that was passed. Now, the next steps for that is how do you determine the payouts and what happens. And so often, unfortunately, you have to wait a long time for this. But the loss and damage, at least it is on the table, so that you can maybe look forward to seeing how going down the pike you can get some assistance for loss and damage. However, my personal opinion on these things is that while we wait for the big countries or the more wealthy we need to look for ourselves. And I use a phrase all the time, is take charge of your vulnerability. I am responsible for myself. Countries, you need to be responsible for yourselves. You can look out, but you cannot wait and say, well, okay, if they don't give it to me, I can't do anything. You will be in a lot of trouble, and your citizens will be in a lot of trouble. So, coming out of COP, and then the other thing that they agreed on was for phasing out of the use of fossil fuels. And of course, you remember that the COP was hosted by the UAE, and the president is the head of the largest oil-producing companies. But what was interesting coming out of that is that some of these countries are earning more money from tourism than they are from oil. That was a revelation to me, because of course they've put their money, let's take Dubai for instance, they put their money into how they have developed the place, that it has become an attraction. So you have people going in, you have conferences going in, and they're making more money out of tourism than out of their oil revenues, which I found very interesting, which speaks to, you talk about the sector approach. Our tourism sector is very vulnerable.
All right.
Look at where we are located. And coming this morning, there was this oceans conference, ocean forum, which I found very enlightening, because they're focusing with youth, Earth ambassadors, and some of the presentations related to how our oceans are in crisis. And Jamaica is, we used to say we're a small island state, we are a large ocean state, because our territorial waters, 24 times as expansive as our land mass. So that's a big resource that we have. And our tourism sector is based on our ecosystems. People come here for our natural resources. And if we are destroying that, then we are really in trouble. So talking about environmental risk, that really underpins what we are doing, where we're focusing. We have to make a balance. We can't just focus on building hotel rooms at the expense of the natural ecosystem service, because our ecosystems provide us with a service. And our coral reefs are bleached because of ocean acidification that is due to global warming. Coral reefs are an important first line of defense against storm surge, destroying your coastal properties, and storm surge, again, associated with hurricanes and the climate change causing more intense hurricanes. So how we manage that coastal resource is very important if we are trying to attract persons to come to enjoy what we have. We have to make sure that we protect what we have, that we balance between, because you have to have development, but development is not just construction, not just concrete.
All right.
It is about livelihoods, it is about quality of life, you know, so we have to look at how we balance. So the environmental risk management is looking at what are all of these ecosystem services, how do they function together, what should we be doing, because you can't manage environmental systems, you don't manage natural systems. You manage how people use natural systems. So we talk environmental management, but it's not management of the environment, it's management of how we use the environmental resources. So that is critical for us.
I was just trying to do a word pretty, so maybe we ought to give it a different name.
Well.
But still on the concept of continuity planning, and I liked the visualization it gave us for the tourism sector, something near and dear to our hearts, and everybody understands what we mean when we give examples within tourism. But you had started speaking about agriculture as well,
Yes.
and you know, what could continuity planning look like for the farming sector or the agriculture industry, I should say.
Yes,
It's not
because
just farming.
also that's exposed to climate extremes and drought and building drought resilience, because it is projected that we're going to have longer periods of dry, and so we have to look at how we use water, how we irrigate. We have to maybe go for drip irrigation. You have places like our St. Elizabeth farmers in the south who had no water, and they produced vegetables at an incredible rate because they long ago understood dry farming, as we call it, where they use mulch and they used drip irrigation, not with the hoses that we know now, but just by having the drums in their fields and so on, which was, we would consider that primitive ways, but it works. So now we need to look at how do we effectively provide water for our plants, and we're talking about climate smart agriculture now, which is an important consideration for us. What do we plant? When do we plant? How do we nurture? And a very important part of this is what we do with our soil, because we have degraded our soils and they just depended on the increasingly heavy dependence on chemical fertilizers for production, which further decimates the soil. So we need to look at how we build back the soil, and we have had agronomists and agriculturalists talking about this for years, but nobody has really taken them seriously and say, why is our productivity so low? We have to pay attention to the natural systems, and building climate smart agriculture is how we manage the water, what we plant. I remember I guess it was Dominica many years ago, again, their banana industry repeated losses from hurricane wind, and they decided, I don't know where they are now because I haven't followed, to do a lot of root crops, because wind can't damage your root crops. And of course, Dominica had major devastation with that hurricane, but they have rebuilt so very well because they were determined to be a leading climate resilient country. So what you plant, and drought resistance, we're doing more research, and we need more research to be able to apply. We need gene pools, and Jamaica used to have quite a reputation with its agricultural research.
Right.
And I think we have kind of slipped back. We need to get back there. How do we do, the drought resistant? What are drought resistant plants? How do we do it? We know Climate Studies Group at UWI, some of the persons there doing research on yams and these kinds of things.
Yeah.
We need to pay attention to that and not just shoot from the hip or fly. So we have a scientific approach.
Yes, I like that you contextualize that as well, especially in light of recent news, though the decision has been reversed. When I had heard that the Caribbean Examination Council was going to pull agricultural science from the curriculum, and I'm like,
that's fundamental.
At a time like this, given climate change, given the concern with food security,
yes.
you understand why is it that we didn't take another approach to see if you can to expand the interest of young people going into the
Yes,
sector and
yes.
pursuing that as a subject rather
Yeah.
than pull it because
Yeah.
you don't have. So you know, it's really interesting, the different areas of agricultural science contribution that you alluded to just now. But I also want to further visualize the farmer now, and even against the backdrop of preparedness and the continuity planning. You had spoken to you know, having a record of loss, and I think that also speaks to the merger of where local knowledge meets the certain modern and different approaches, because some of our farmers, a lot has been happening in where the Ministry of Agriculture as well as other organizations trying to move farmers forward in terms of how they look at farming as a business. And I think record keeping is an
Yes,
important
right.
part of that.
And managing finance.
And how does that link or relate to, you know, either disaster preparedness or planning for disaster?
Well, recovery and bouncing forward and building back better, because what you're doing is you're improving income, you're improving livelihoods, which is very important. You want the farmer to begin to think of not just a poor farmer.
Yes.
So even if you have 1 acre, how do I get the most out of it? And this is where I think RADA does a good job, and what used to be called extension officers at one time, and more education, more working with them in the field and learning from them, because you learn a lot. Local knowledge is very instructive. People, they live close to it and they know, and so you have conversations. It's not a dictatorial way of saying, well, I know what's good for you and I'm going to give it, because nobody will pay any attention. And some of how they think may not necessarily be the best scientific way. So you have a conversation and you share that, so you learn from each other. But I think it's very important. Sensitization, education is key.
Right, right. So another question that I wanted to look at, especially in the context of disaster planning, there has been a lot of calls with focusing on our vulnerable communities, whether it's women, youth,
Yeah.
you know, the differently able, the LGBTQ plus community, and, you know, other groups, the differently abled.
Yeah.
And so in the context of disaster planning and continuity planning, what are some of the things that we should be giving consideration to?
Well, integrating the needs of these groups into the planning, into the pre-disaster planning, and speaking about the recovery framework for the Caribbean, it's the gender focus, inserting gender, but gender meaning inclusivity, not men and women only, but just all of these groups, the aged, the poor, all vulnerable groups included. And you look at their needs. So the consultations, for example, included bringing these people to the table, different groups to the table. Tell us how you see this and what are some of your particular needs. You know, the blind, they can't. What was it? I remember one of the blind associations with the pandemic, how they were dealing with, you know, your hands. You can't. They need their hands. And yet you were told, don't touch this, don't touch that, how you deal with it. And those were some realities that the average person would not have thought about.
Yes.
So you have to learn and you have to integrate them into the planning.
So
Do a needs assessment,
right,
and have the conversations.
So to break that down a little further, because I feel like a lot of times people are challenged sometimes with understanding, especially when you're not close to this sector, when we always talk about the gender responsive approaches. So aside from a consultation, I don't know, is there like in practical terms or scenarios, maybe at a community level, that we can show people, you know, what do we mean? So I don't know. So
yeah,
to help.
I don't know that I can answer that fully, but I think an important start is by bringing persons to the table. What are the needs? Are there some specific needs? You know, for the deaf, for the which are the ones that we know most, the physically challenged. You know, what do we need for persons such as those? Signage, sounds, you know, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I guess hopefully people will know here and recognize that from an organizational level, from a community
Right.
level, you have these distinct groups. And now, as you said, if it's even a case of maybe a survey in your organization
Yeah.
and running, because it's so interesting with how we've normalized just moving along. So before I heard conversations around gender responsive approaches, it was just so surprising to me how much we've just gone about our days and make individual provisions. So I remember perhaps you mentioned earlier when we were setting up about the 20 plus year anniversary of Ivan.
Yes.
And so as a young high school student in 7th grade, I remember after Ivan, having weeks without water.
Right, and power.
And power.
Yeah.
So although being from the country, I had water in barrels.
Yeah.
So I remember how grateful I was, because young as I was a menstruating little girl.
Yeah.
And I was really great. I recall just being grateful that I had the opportunity to bathe, to have water.
Yeah.
And so it didn't disrupt that experience for me.
Exactly.
And so I think those things.
Those are the things that are important, because some things never go away. There are some principles that remain.
Yes. Yeah. So it's what you're sharing with us. It's rolling out a lot of possibilities as to what, or opportunities rather, of the things that we can consider. So as we're winding down, the penultimate question I have for you, or the second to last question, is around communication that's related to environmental risk. And I remember certain organizations had come under fire a little bit when we had the earthquake scares recently, and there were gaps in the communication framework. So even linking it back to the broader thing.
Communication is fundamental, and communication in its broadest sense. So what do we mean? Communication is not just ODPEM sending out messages or JIS sending out messages, but you have your community groups, you have your church groups, you have to look at the different avenues or vehicles through which, and the messaging. What are we trying to tell people, and begin with people where they are. So,
what does that mean?
That means that you can't assume that people know, and you should break things down in a way that is understandable, and also give room for questions, because sometimes some of the questions that come may seem absurd, but I used to say there's no such thing as a stupid question, because if you don't know, you don't know, and you should ask, you should seek an answer.
Right.
And no matter where you are, and so therefore I think that communication is key. So the messaging, the data, and we need to understand in a holistic way, what are we dealing with in terms of these. I heard a lady this morning from the private sector in that ocean, when she heard all of the presentations, she said, what are we doing as a people? We're not doing anything, and we are in crisis. We are in terrible crisis, but who knows about that? It's not, the word is not out there in a way that we can understand what's in it for me is another phrase. Why should I be engaged with this? Should be a part of that communication, that message. So you present it, which is what I mean by being where you are. You present it in a way that it makes a difference. For instance, the climate crisis, climate and health are integrally involved. And if you can break that down to say, okay, this is what is going to happen, air quality, how it's going to affect your children, how it's going to affect asthma, how it's going to, so that what's in it for me? Why should I pay attention? Because it's going to affect me in this way.
Right.
So that I think our communication must be targeted and not just broad brush messages, and you assume, but because I put that message out there, well, we have been telling people. No, well, the communication is how it is received and assimilated.
You're absolutely right.
You know?
And I think even with the advent of social media, and while you might be able to sponsor an ad and a lot of people see it, are the people who need to see it, seeing it. So
and are they listening? Are they hearing? You can listen,
Right.
but are you hearing?
So even following from the examples that you gave, now I realize and that even for disaster risk and the communication that follows that, it means that if I'm in the tourism sector, something has applied to me. If I'm a farmer, rather other extension or other interacting agencies need to be doing something, giving me some different kind of information.
Right.
So do we have like a national strategy for disaster communication, or is that something that will be helpful to the process?
I believe we do, but what happens to us in Jamaica, we build and then we ignore. We push it aside, and then when there's a crisis, we try to pull it out and try to do something. We're not consistent. We don't build, so you have like a roller coaster ride or a ping pong game. So I don't know that there's a national strategy for communication. NORPIM, I think, would be best able to say that, but there ought to be, and the communication is not just in hurricane season, which is what tends to happen.
Yes.
That's when the National Disaster Council comes together, the beginning of how prepared are you as government agencies? You have a big room of people talking about whether they are prepared or not. I don't think that is the best way. I think we need to get it right down to, persons doing what they need to do in their respective areas.
Well said, well said. I think Miss Jones, sitting here having this conversation with you, I think you've literally built out an environmental risk management plan. Certainly, even if not detailed, a lot of good things that could constitute a robust framework.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So for people who are listening, if it is, I'm not gonna pressure you by saying if it's one thing that they should take away, but certainly as we look toward the hurricane season, I think they said there's over 25 named storms, 7 of them that could be major hurricanes. What are some food for thought that we should be, different members of society?
You need to look at where you live and how exposed you might be to flooding or wind damage. What are the key things with a hurricane? You need to do that. At your business place, you need to also look at that. You need to look at how you're disposing of waste. Make sure you don't have a lot of waste accumulated around you, and make sure that you're not just dumping on the roads. And, I would like to see people take more responsibility for how they dispose of waste, because while we talk about banning plastics or whatever, at the end of the day, you dispose of it badly. But if it's paper and you dispose of it badly, you're still going to clog the drains. So how do we manage waste? That's an important takeaway from managing environmental risk. And again, coming back to the business of health, you don't want to have situations where you generate rats and mosquitoes, and because all of these are environmental health risks and waste. So take responsibility for your own environment, take responsibility for your family's health, because a good part of it is health. If you have a landslide that's going to tumble down on your house, there's a health aspect to that as well, if you survive, So we need to just pay attention as individuals and not just look to the other person. What is so-and-so doing? We have a tendency to say, what is this person doing? What is this agency doing? What is the government doing? So we need to begin to say, what am I doing?
All right, what am I doing? I love that as a closer. What am I doing? What are you doing? So I think for me, some of the examples that you gave, or when we ask the question, what are those people doing? If we have an answer, then maybe we should create our own version of that action to guide us forward and to help us respond or manage, as you would have said, environmental risk. I want to thank you so much, Ms. Jones, for sharing with us all that you have on environmental risk management. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
It was a pleasure talking with you as well, Madam Global Yardie. Dainalyn.
All right, thank you. So thank you so much for listening to another episode. Please, you know what to do. Keep on watching, following, subscribing, and share widely. Do take care.
Global Yardie.